Witness is the chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee. The next witness, next questioner, the chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, Senator Feinstein, and it's a great advantage to us to have her on this committee.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to begin by putting a couple of letters in the record. These have just been declassified. The first is a letter to myself and Senator Chambliss on February 2nd, 2011, before this program came up before the Senate, explaining it, making the information available. The second is that same letter to the House. So we have before 2010 and 2011. I'd also
objection, that'll be made part of the record.
Thank you. I'd also like to. I just realized that I believe Mr. Inglis's statement makes public for the first time a fact, and it's an important fact. Can you tell us how many orders, how many probable cause warrants were issued by the FBI in 2012?
I can't off the top of my head, Senator. I can get you those numbers, though, following the hearing.
Well, I think we'd appreciate that. I think
I would just add, though, you make a very good point, whether it's the 702 program or the Business Record 215, once that information is passed to us involving anyone in the United States, we must go to the FISC, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, and show probable cause on the FISC warrant, basically to provide content or whatever as far as overhears for that specific individual.
Good. Now, the NSA has produced and declassified a chart, which I'd like to make available to all members. It has the 54 total events. It includes a Section 702 authority and Section 215 authority, which essentially work together. And it shows the events disrupted based on a combination of these two programs. 13 in the homeland, 25 in Europe, 5 in Africa, and 11 in Asia. Now, I remember I was on the Intelligence Committee before 9/11, and I remember how little information we have and the great criticism of the government because of these stovepipes, the inability to share intelligence, the inability to collect intelligence. We had no program that could have possibly caught 2 people in San Diego before the event took place. I support this program. I think, based on what I know, they will come after us. And I think we need to prevent an attack wherever we can from happening. That doesn't mean that we can't make some changes. Yesterday at the Intelligence Committee, I outlined some changes that we might consider as part of our authorization bill. And let me quickly run through them. The number of American phone numbers submitted as queries on a regular basis annually from the database. The number of referrals made to the FBI each year based on those queries, and how many times the FBI obtains probable cause warrants to collect the content of a call, which we now know is very few times relatively. The number of times that a company, this is at their request from the high-tech companies, that any company is required to provide data pursuant to FISA's business records provision. As you know, the companies who provide information are seeking to be able to speak more publicly about this, and I think we should. There are some changes we can make to the business records section. We're looking at reducing the 5-year retention period.
That NSA keeps phone records in its database down to 2 or 3 years.
It's my understanding that the usefulness of it tails off as the years go on. We have to determine that point and then consider it. And requiring the NSA to send to the FISA court for its review the records of each query of the database as soon as is practicable so the court can determine the propriety of the query under the law. These are things that can be done to increase transparency, but not to stop the program. I believe, based on what I have seen, and I read intelligence regularly, that we would place this nation in jeopardy if we eliminated these two programs. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Senator Feinstein said, ask him about the expense.
I would say in a classified session, I could give you chapter and verse on the expense. The expenses are different depending upon whether you choose the current implementation and you choose an implementation where you leave it at the providers. The government, if it requires the providers to retain those records, should bear that expense.
Thank you.
Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I understand it, the NSA's collection of metadata, the kind of metadata that we've been discussing today, is accomplished pursuant to Section 215 of the Patriot Act. Now, Section 215B2A of the Patriot Act places an important limitation on that collection in that it limits the government's ability to collect that metadata to circumstances where the data in question is, quote, relevant to an authorized investigation, close quote. At some point, relevance is a concept that is difficult to define in the abstract. It is a somewhat fluid concept, and it's one of those things that some jurists might say, I know it when I see it, but I struggle to define it. Yet, regardless of how difficult it might be to define in the abstract what relevance is, don't you think we have left the station of relevance long before we get to the point of collecting metadata on potentially 300 million Americans and their cell phone usage? How can one get one's mind around the concept of that volume of information, metadata or otherwise, all being relevant to an ongoing investigation?
Well, Senator, Mr. Litton, he can chime in, had noted a little bit earlier how broad, as you noted yourself, the concept of relevance is in civil discovery and many different kinds of legal contexts. It can be things that will lead you to things that you need. Right. As a concept for relevance.
I understand Mr. Litt's very broad conception of relevance, and as he recently explained in his comments at the Brookings Institution. But I assure you, as a recovering lawyer myself, there is no context in civil discovery or otherwise in which one may define relevance broadly enough to take in information regarding each and every single American who owns a telephone.
The answer I would give you to that, Senator, is that we are not really accessing or getting into all of that metadata that is stored in that database. We don't actually get to roam around in it. We don't get to look at it to our heart's content and then say, well, this is relevant and that's relevant, so let's take that. You have to look at it in the context of the primary order, which was declassified and issued today, that says the only way you can access it is if you have reasonable articulable suspicion that the number you are going to query off of is in fact related to specific terrorist groups. And that has to be documented. And if you don't have that, you can't get into this. So the surveillance concept, I think, is very important here. You cannot surveil this without that gate being checked through.
If I can just, and that gate is not controlled by a warrant. I mean, if you want to access that, you don't have to go to court to get a warrant to access that. Those are controlled by internal procedures, correct?
That's correct, but they are controlled by the court order, and they are controlled by compliance audits that are done both by the executive branch and the court looks at how it's implemented on a periodic basis.
Okay, Mr. Litt, did you have something to add?
Yes, just very briefly. I just want to make clear that the standard of relevance that I articulated in the speech is not mine alone. This is one that's been approved by the judges of the FISA court and was known to members of this committee and the Intelligence Committee at the time that the Section 215 authority was renewed.
No, I understand that. I understand that, and that's been part of the problem we've had is that. Until recently, most people didn't have any idea about those, and we had significant constraints that limited our ability to explain why some of us had concerns with the Patriot Act, why some of us on both sides of the aisle voted against reauthorizing the Patriot Act. We were unable to speak about this publicly because we have secret procedures being undertaken pursuant to secret law, and it has been a bit of a problem. Now, what would you say then, getting back to you, Mr. Cole, to my constituents? I understand what you're saying, that we're collecting all of it, but we're not looking at it. We're collecting it, but we're closing our eyes. So don't worry about it. What would you say to my constituents who say, I don't want the government having that information? It's not the government's information. It still doesn't make it relevant under the law. It still doesn't meet what many of my constituents believe to be well within their reasonable expectation of privacy for the government to collect that much information, potentially information about 300 million Americans.
Well, I would say two things. First of all, we have had 34 separate times a court say that does meet the standard of relevance to have it all and then have the restrictions. But the further thing that I would say, which I think is very important, is what we're doing here today, which is it's worth having a debate about is there a better way to do it. It's worth having a debate about where we're going to strike that balance between security for the nation and making sure that people's privacy and civil liberty rights are being honored. And that's a tough balance to find, but it's a balance worth talking about, and it's the process that we are welcoming and engaging in right now.
Okay, thank you. I see my time's expired. I just want to come in. I appreciate your insight on this. I do think it is worth discussing publicly, and I think it's also something that we need to consider from a constitutional standpoint. We have been relying on a 34-year-old Supreme Court case, Smith v. Maryland, to get at this idea that metadata is somehow beyond the reach of the Fourth Amendment. But we have to remember that Smith did not involve collection on hundreds of millions of Americans. It involved collection on a single target. It involved collection in a manner that is completely archaic by today's standards, and that by today's standards would involve a minuscule amount of information. I think at some point when you collect that much data on that many people, whether it's that much data on one person, that might create some problem. That much data on hundreds of millions of people creates an even bigger problem, and one that I think was not considered by the Supreme Court of the United States in Maryland v. Smith.
Thank you.
One that we need to revisit. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Lee. Senator Whitehouse, you've again showing the expertise here. You served both on this committee and you've served on the Intelligence Committee. Appreciate you being here.
Thank you, Chairman. One of the, Mr. Cole, you just said it's worth having a debate on these issues. And I think you're right about that. But I also hope that the executive branch takes a lesson from this experience about the value of classification, or what I would consider over-classification. I've seen this over and over now. When we were fighting with the Bush administration about the torture program, the executive branch got to tell its side of the story because the executive branch were the declassifiers, and we were stuck with facts that we knew that blew up the argument that was being made by the executive branch, but that we could not articulate because they were classified. We've seen it on cyber, where so much of the American public is unaware of the cyber threat that we're facing. Now, thankfully, that we're becoming more aware, but for a long time, we were just in the dark about what was going on because in the private sector, companies didn't want to talk about it for fear of aggravating their regulators, their consumers, their clients, their even giving their competitors advantage. And the government just wildly overclassified everything. Now we have, I think, a terrific article that Senator Feinstein wrote. We have, I think, very good testimony by Bob Mueller. We have a lot of good information out there that helps the American public understand these programs.